Today we're on the trail with a late model JK and a LT1 10-speed. This is a real LT1. This isn't a L86 that was updated to an LT1. It's a fantastic driving Jeep as usual. We've had a pretty hot summer the last couple of weeks. We were pushing over 120 degrees. So I thought I would revisit cooling because I'm getting calls from customers, not only with our conversions, but with other conversions that are having overheating problems. So this Jeep isn't too bad. You can see that he doesn't have a winch. Now, if he did have a winch, it would probably stick up too high and deflect some of the air above the grill. So here's a couple of rules that you really need to follow. One, keep this grill open. Don't put grill inserts in it. Don't put screens in it if you can help it. Now in the winter you'll get away with that, but in a really hot summer it does help to keep this open, because any restriction here is going to create a bubble of high pressure, and that's just going to cause the airflow to go over. You want it to go into the grill. You want to run these flaps. These are missing. They will be replaced. But that's important to keep the air going through the radiator rather than going around it. This is a transmission cooler from a Penstar. Then we have an AC condenser. Then we have a radiator. So remember, here you got a transmission cooler probably running 150, 160 degrees. That's going into this AC condenser, which is 1 pound approximately per PSI. So if you're running 200 PSI, that's 200 degrees. Then you got a radiator behind that. And the fan's got to suck through all that. And we got a powerful fan. Let me say something about this bumper. When you have a hoop like this, what happens is the air comes in, hits it, and shoots up over the hood. Remember, you got this high pressure bubble here. We want this air to go into the grill, not above it. Jeep does have a deflector or a valance panel on the bottom. They have a valance panel up here. They have flaps here. Everything is designed about forcing air through this grill. Jeeps with hoops, you say, well, this doesn't do a whole lot of harm. But when I start going 75, 80 plus miles an hour, this hoop becomes important, because that airflow stream hitting us at 80 miles an hour is just shooting right up over the hood. And I just took a Jeep up to Park City that was running a little bit warm. Actually, it was running really warm. It wasn't overheating, but it was running really warm, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But the faster I went, the higher the fan speed went. And it really should be the opposite, or not increase speed, because the more air you cram through that radiator, the cooler it should run. But the reality was the hoop was causing it to fly up over the hood, and the fan worked harder and harder and harder until it couldn't work anymore. The other problem with that Jeep was the fender wells. Now this one's got stock fender wells that look like they were cut for the bigger tires, but notice how Jeep leaves a big gap down there, right up in here. That's for a reason. That's to allow the air to come out, because you're cramming all this air into the grill. You got hot air under the hood under high pressure. It's got to go somewhere. So this other Jeep I had, and this is something that I talked to a lot of the manufacturers about 10 years ago, is they're making these fender liners where they're coming right in. This one actually sealed up against the frame, literally sealed. And it sealed this engine compartment. Then he had, of course, a winch and the bumper and the hoop. And on this side, it was completely sealed. I measured underhood temps close to 300 degrees. I saw plastic starting to melt over by the brake booster because the restriction. So he restricted the air coming in, he restricted the air going out. It wasn't a good setup. So we actually removed the fender liners, and the temperatures dropped dramatically. And we've been doing that for years. In the hot summer, we've been taking the fender liners out. But it literally took that Jeep from the verge of overheating to being acceptable. Some of the cold air hoods can make a difference, but it's not super dramatic. If your Jeep's going to overheat, you really need to add cooling. So that's another thing that we're going to talk about. And I'll talk about that during the drive. Let's take a look at this Jeep. It's a nice looking Jeep, Commander, I guess that was a model. Seems like every few years Jeep comes out with a new sticker to put on, Arctic or Islander or whatever, and make you pay a few extra dollars. It's got this cool soft top thing going on. So we're gonna finish this trail, and then I'm gonna, let's take a look under the hood. There you go, guys. There's our standard LT1. Interstate wet lead acid battery. Chipman's been turned, Motec intake. No hydraulics on this one, but it steers great. Just a pretty simple build. We're back on the highway after getting off the trail, and I wanted to talk more about what you can do to keep your JK cool. So obviously, keeping the grill clear is really important. And I say this in all of my videos, and I've been saying it for years, as have others, including Jeep. It's ironic that Jeep says do not obstruct your grill with anything, yet the Jeep dealerships sell grill inserts and winches that can block your grill. But you can get away with that. If you have a Jeep on 32-inch tires and you're living in a relatively cool climate at low altitude, you're fine. But if you're towing a trailer in Colorado at 10,000 feet with a high compression V8 engine, you don't want to block that grill. So that's pretty obvious. Winches. Winch is fine. Sink it. Get a bumper that you're happy with, but make sure it sinks the winch. You don't want the winch really to stick up into the openings of the grill. And if you get a Warn 9000 synthetic or whatever, there's plenty of bumpers out there that'll support them. Evo, Metal Cloak, there's a ton of bumpers out there. I like Lodi. Get whatever you like, but make sure it sinks that winch. Some winches have a control box on top. I removed my control box and mounted it remotely on the side because the control box can deflect air away from the grill and up over the hood. Try to stay away from winches like the Warn power plant that has a compressor built in on the top. They're really tall, and even when you do sink them, they're still sticking up significantly into the grill. Now remember, all it takes is something several inches high to deflect that high-speed air away from your grill. Likewise, as indicated earlier, a hoop can do the same thing. A 3-inch tube hoop, a foot out from in front of your grill, is like an airfoil. It can deflect that air right up over the hood. And I know this when I look at the data on the fan. If I see the fan working less and less the faster I go, I know that you got proper airflow. If I see the fan working harder and harder the faster I go, it usually means we have an obstruction. Now the obstruction may not just be the grill, it may be the fender wells, like I said. Air's got to come in and air's got to go out. So don't block those fender wells. Cold air hoods can help, but I find they don't help a whole lot. Try to stay away from a cold air hood that has screens or vents over the accessory driver engine that let water in. Try to avoid hoods that can puddle water, like the old Moab hood, and then it freezes and you take off and it comes back and it bashes your windshield. Cold air hoods can help, but a lot of it also depends on the hood. If you look at like a ZL2 hood from a Camaro, it picks up the high pressure at the base of the windshield. Other hoods that have scoops out in front don't really do a whole lot of good. I don't know if you guys remember the Challenger TA, but it had essentially a P51 scoop upside down, and it raised the opening of the scoop off the boundary layer of the hood. So it was raised up several inches. And I'm sorry guys, we have this soft top that's rattling away. It's got clips on it that are rattling, so I hope you can hear me. So you want to get a hood that is designed efficiently, that will evacuate the hot air out of the engine compartment. Now remember, under the hood is high pressure air. Outside the atmosphere is low pressure air. So the fan has the job of sucking that low pressure air into a high pressure zone. And while it's doing it, it has to suck it through a transmission cooler and an AC condenser. And then it has to fight all the obstructions in the engine compartment. Like with a Pentastar, it has that giant engine cover on it that I found if you remove it, promotes better airflow in the engine compartment, can actually help you cool. So you want the air to go in and come out. Now along the same thread as the winch are the LED light bar, the KC daylighters and all that. If you have to put those things on the bumper, put them outboard. Get those daylighters out on the ends of the bumper or your light bars. Get them away from being in front of the grill. Now again, in a colder climate, you might be okay. But when we're pushing 120 degrees plus out here, you're running 40-inch tires, you're at high altitude, that's a lot of strain on the cooling system. So here's my favorite thing to do to help with cooling, and that is to off-board it. You know we got all sorts of things making heat. We got the engine making heat, we got the transmission making heat. Obviously the radiator is trying to get rid of that heat. A lot of the heat's going out the exhaust. But think about this, most guys just want to get a bigger radiator and a bigger fan. But then you're still limited to the JK engine compartment, how big it is, how much air can flow. We're only running about a 22-inch core because that's as big of a core as the JK can accept. We're not running a 26 or 30-inch core like some of the bigger trucks. They have the luxury of really high capacity cooling systems, and we don't. So the new trend in these Jeeps, and it's been a trend for a long time with the military and exotics, is just to get multiple coolers and put them everywhere. Yes, it costs more and it is more complex, but by shedding that heat into the atmosphere, you're not putting it into the radiator and then into the engine compartment, which you have to try to get rid of. So I think the first line of defense would be the rock rail cooler for the transmission. I like the 23-inch, which will fit in the JK. If you have exotic rock rails, electric rock rails, or some kind of aftermarket rock rail that won't accept the 23-inch, there's a 14-inch, there's a 10-inch, they come in all sorts of sizes. But I do find that that does help keep heat out of the engine compartment. These new modern transmissions do tend to run pretty cool. Jeeps with 40s especially need the extra transmission cooling. One of the things we discovered years ago was GM was including a thermostat in the transmission cooler lines that would force the temperature high. And we noticed by using the newer cooler lines where they dropped the thermostat in the cooler line, the transmissions run much, much cooler. In fact, look here. I've been wheeling all day and it's about 100 out right now and I'm at 154 degrees. So run the cooler lines that don't have the thermostat and run the rail cooler. Run the biggest one you can get in there. You should be able to run a 23-inch. And sometimes we will actually trim the rock rail so we can get the bigger coolers in there. Now, it's a dumb cooler, meaning it doesn't have a fan on it. It's just a radiant heat sink. Over the years, I've had guys say you're going to bash, it's going to leak. But the reality is, it's extruded aluminum. You could bash all the fins off, and it's still most likely not going to leak. In all the years we've been doing this, I still haven't had one leak from being damaged, and I've had them on some pretty exotic JKs. Now, I have had them leak from the fittings. The fittings can be a pain. You tighten them. Usually they're a national pipe thread. Sometimes they're an AN. But I've seen the fittings leak more than I've seen the coolers leak. Get a high quality cooler though. I find that the cheaper coolers can leak around the welds and fittings. Now let's move over to the driver's side. If you've got an LS or an LT, you can easily install another radiant cooler for the engine oil. Engine oil can run pretty hot. Some vehicles like Porsches and others use gallons of engine oil to cool the engine. They mount coolers all over the place. Like I remember the old 911s, they'd have a oil cooler up front and the engine was in the rear, and all that oil helped cool the engine because of the capacity. So on all the LT1s like I'm in right now, we do run an external cooler, and that's because the LT1 pan has an oil cooler built into it. It's a water to oil cooler though, and it uses coolant. Now the Jeep JL and JT are doing a similar thing where they're offboarding some of the heat. You got an EGR cooler that's water cooled. You got a transmission cooler on the top of the transmission that's water cooled. They got hoses going everywhere, cooling stuff. But the point is, those coolers are not in the engine compartment or going through the radiator. They're offboarding that heat, and that's my point. That should pretty much do it for the average JK. If you have 35 to 37-inch tires, you're running at reasonable altitudes, you're not towing a trailer, you keep your grill clear, you have the Motec radiator. The Motec quad-header radiator runs 2 headers on each side, like a Caterpillar tractor. And then we beefed up the tube. And then we took all the strapping and gussets and everything else off to allow the radiator to flex with the vehicle. And that was a problem. For years we tried to make the radiator stronger and stiffer like a lot of guys out there have done. But the problem is the JK is just going to flex. That's all there is to it. An aluminum radiator is like an aluminum brick, and you start twisting it, it's going to crack. The OE radiator is plastic and aluminum. It's got plastic tanks that are crimped on with rubber seals. That radiator can flex all day and not crack, but it doesn't have the capacity that we need. So ultimately, if we had a plastic aluminum radiator that was large, it would be ideal, but we don't. So the aluminum dissipates heat really good, and the new quad header radiator, in my opinion, is top of the line. We're seeing them go year after year with very few failures. So if you have the quad header radiator, you got the rail cooler, you add the transmission cooler, the grill is completely unobstructed, your wheel wells are not obstructed, holding the hot air in, then that's going to do it for most JKs, even out here in the Southwest. I remember years and years ago going up to St. George. I think it was with Phil Howell. Not St. George, it was Sand Hollow. And there were some Jeeps out there, and we were running pretty hard in the sand, and it was, you know, it gets pretty hot out there. It's 100 degrees plus. And I remember seeing the battery trays starting to melt. The plastic was getting soft. One guy had headers on his, and literally it got so hot, it melted through the battery tray, melted the battery, and the battery was dripping acid out the bottom. And of course he had fender liners that had no venting. Because back at the beginning, a lot of the manufacturers, and I don't want to say the names, they were just making solid fender wells. And I talked to them. I talked to a lot of them, and I says, look, you guys got to vent these. And then you started seeing louvers and screens and everything else being put in them, or guys just drilling half-inch holes. But remember, you got to think of the engine compartment as an air tunnel. The air's got to go in and out. The engine compartment is under a higher pressure than the atmosphere outside, so it's difficult to pull that air in. So just use common sense. You got to get air through that engine compartment. I have a thermal probe for one of my MasterTech lab scopes, and you can't believe how hot the underhood temps can get in these vehicles. I've seen them approach 300 degrees, like I said. So don't think just getting a more powerful fan or a bigger radiator is going to solve your problem. It might help, but remember, that hot air has got to go somewhere. It's got to get out of the engine compartment. It's got to get in, so make sure you're not blocking it, even with a hoop. You may consider getting a bumper like the Metal Cloak that's modular, where you can unbolt the hoop in the summer and install it back on the winter or when you're on the trail. So let's talk about some more extreme cooling options. Let's just say you're on 40s, you're running out in the desert and it's really hot. There is another option that we have for the guys running 40+ inch tires out in the desert, and that's the transmission cooler with the fan built in, and we mount that in the rear. Again, we're taking the air away from the engine compartment and putting it into the atmosphere. Now, you can't make those coolers too big. Sometimes they use dual coolers. On a recent LT5 build, we had several coolers in the back. We had an intercooler, we had a transmission cooler, we have engine oil coolers, just coolers everywhere. Some of the exotics, I think, I don't know if it was a Lotus, not the Corvette, had 9 different heat exchangers in the vehicle. It may have been the McLaren, but they've got these coolers everywhere around the vehicle. And if airflow is accessible, they use airflow. If not, they put a fan on it. And military vehicles have been doing that for a long time also, in heavy-duty trucks. So I want you to get away from this thinking of, oh, I'm going to get a bigger radiator and a bigger fan, and that's going to solve my cooling problems. What you really need to do is off-board that air. And we have several products available to do that. Oh, one final thing. Guys are calling me and saying, hey, my engine's overheating. And I'll say, well, how much is it running at? What's the temperature? It hit 212. Well, guys, let me just kind of run through this again. The earlier generations of engines, I remember small block Chevys, we put the 160 and 180 thermostats in. But you got to remember, we were running 5,000 piston clearance in those engines. Today we're running 10s of 1,000s piston clearance. These engines are tight. They're running really low viscosity oil, 0-20 in some cases. So these things need to be thermally efficient. GM wants to see these things warm up to 195, 196, 200, and 200 to 230 is completely normal. If you see your gauge hit 212, 220, 225, don't worry about it. If you hit 230, 235, you're not causing any damage. If you hit 240, that's when I back off, turn the air conditioning off. And I've had to do that. I had to do it with that Jeep I just talked about, because he had the airflow blocked with the fender wells and he had the grill blocked. But turning the AC off meant I could continue on at 80 miles an hour and not worry about it. Because he had the hoop in front of his grill, it was deflecting the air away and the fan was screaming, but I was able to continue on. But I was probably pushing 230, 235. Now, if you're going to go 245, 250, you need more cooling. You need to do something. You need to get better airflow or more cooling capacity. GM considers 255 overheat. So 255 is a long way from 212. And on your gauge in a JK, this is a customer satisfaction gauge. If they actually showed you where the coolant was, then they'd probably get more complaints. So what they do is, at about 185, the JK gauge goes up to about half, or just before half. And it kind of stays there until about 225, 230. I don't like that because it's not linear. You don't really have a warning. It goes from 180, 190, 200, 210, 220, and then all of a sudden it just shoots off of half gauge and you overheat. If it was linear and you could see that precise movement, it would be better, because then you could react faster. Now, if you do have a Motec conversion, we change that. We make the gauge linear. So if you're at 180, 190, 200, you're going to be around half. But 210, 215, 220, you're going to be the right side of the middle. 230, 235, you're going to be at 3/4. So you can judge exactly how hot the engine is off the gauge, and you don't have that stupid customer satisfaction gauge. I want to see it run between 195 and 230. If you're running there, you're fine. If you hit 235 every once in a while, you're fine. Don't panic. You might want to turn your air conditioner off. Like if you go to the Baker grade or some of these other grades around the country, they'll say at the bottom of the hill, turn AC off to prevent overheating. And yeah, Baker is below sea level, so it's in Death Valley. It gets really hot there, and you got a 26-mile grade that averages 6 or 7%, and that's going to be tough on the cooling system. So turning the AC off might be an option, but if you have enough cooling capacity, you don't even have to turn the AC off. So what it comes down to is logic and common sense. Don't block the airflow through your engine compartment. Add coolers as needed. All of you may not need everything. Most of you will only need an additional cooler or two. The Jeep I'm running right now has our standard quad header radiator. The grill is relatively unblocked, but it does have a hoop in front of it. It looks like he had a non-sunk bumper for his winch, and my guess is he took it off and he's going to get a sunk bumper, knowing he's going to the V8. He has a oil cooler on the left rail, because we do that in all the LT1s, and it's optional in everything else. He does not have a transmission cooler, at least I don't think he does. But look, my transmission is running at 152 degrees, and it's 95 degrees out right now. We just had a thunder and rainstorm here in Vegas, and it took the temps way down. But still, we're almost 100 degrees, and we're running 150. We have the non-thermostat lines in this Jeep. I just went to the mountain, I just drove it on the highway. So this Jeep really doesn't need any more cooling, in my opinion. I think it's doing just fine. But if you're the guy running 40s and you drive hard, you're in a hot environment, high altitude, towing, whatever, get airflow through the engine compartment, add coolers as needed. I don't care if you got 5, 6, 7 coolers on your Jeep. Whatever's required, put on. Now, with some builds, we do add additional coolers with fans that are off-boarded, and we have switches. Other ones, like on LT 4s and 5s, when you turn the vehicle on, the fans will just come on. We found like the intercooler pumps, we were controlling them through the computer, but I really like just turning them on, because the cooler the intake temp runs, there's before the blower and after the blower, the more power it has, the more response it has, and all that. So we change up how we control these fans, really based on the need. And one final thing, we do have a fan controller, guys, and I've sold quite a few of them here recently. We don't really market it, but it's like nothing else out there on the market. Our fan controller, and I'm going to be doing a video on it, we've been running it for years. Our fan controller can take a analog or a CAN input from either a GM or a Chrysler system. What that means is you can hook 2 wires up to the CAN, and it'll get all the signals it needs to run the fan. And that includes transmission temperature, AC pressure, engine coolant temp, vehicle speed, intake temp, all that stuff. Most of the fan controllers out there today just run off a coolant temp, and then they either ignore the transmission temp or have a wire that's kind of like a switch. And the same thing with air conditioning. When you turn the air conditioning on, it just turns the fan on high. Our fan controller doesn't do that. Our fan controller is fully modulated. It's pulse width modulated, so that it only puts out as much as you need. If the AC pressure hits 200, it comes on slow. Engine temperature hits 225, it comes on slow. Intake temp goes over 175, it comes on low. Transmission temperature hits 175, it comes on low. And then of course it winds up, and it has priority. Whichever parameter requires the most cooling, it's going to get it. But here's the thing, if you turn your AC on, let's say your engine's running at 225, you turn the AC on, now the condenser gets up to 250 PSI, fan turns on, AC pressure comes down, but so does coolant temp. Coolant temp comes down because the radiator's right there with the AC condenser. Our module looks at all those signals, and then it decides the output of the fan. It's not one of these over-glorified controllers where it just has 3 speeds or 5 speeds, and then it has additional wire inputs for the AC, so when you just hook it up to the clutch. And I hate that, because when the air conditioning turns on, the fan turns on high, and it's screaming, and then the AC turns off, the clutch disengages, and then it goes silent. And then you don't want to do that. So our fan controller is fully modulated, and like I said, it has CAN input, so if you have a compatible CAN system, Chrysler or GM, that includes Hemi, you can just hook those 2 wires up, and then it'll pull all the signals off the CAN network and control your fan with a simple 1-wire output. And then of course, like an SS fan or a JL fan has 2 cables going to the battery, and I call them cables because they're pretty heavy gauge. Now on the flip side, if you have an old hot rod or an old TJ or something, and you don't have a compatible CAN network, we have analog inputs. We have an analog input for the AC. Most manufacturers these days use a 0 to 5 volt signal, 1 volt being 100 PSI, 2 volts being 200 PSI. Jeep does that, GM does that. So you just hook that 1 wire in, you get AC. Same thing with coolant temp, 0 to 5 volt thermistor or temperature sensor. Same thing with transmission temp. They have a transmission temp built into the transmission. So you can now hardwire those signals into our controller and get the same fan operation that you get over the CAN bus. It's just more work. But we've sold these controllers over the years to help guys with Hemis that have like manual transmissions and don't have valid coolant temp signals into the TIPM. We've put them on our custom bills, like some of the GM Performance bills, LT5s, that don't have the fan tables populated. It's a good solution. Now, if you can use an ECM based fan control, I suggest you do it. It's there, it's programmable. Why not use it? And by the way, our fan controller is fully programmable too. You will get a GUI that will show you all the different parameters, and you can set it up however you want. So anyway, this video has gone way too long. Got a lot more stuff in the shop, a lot more test drives, and we'll see you soon.